we are basically finished. So we're going to go ahead and loosen up and remove our wheels, our jig wheels. That one's a little tight. And we're going to pull the axle. And a little bit of the flux gets melted in there, so you can kind of see that junk all there. But you can see our aluminum tube and a little bit of graphite we put on it with the pencil tip has prevented us from soldering our bushings to our axle. If we used a steel axle, we would have had a nice static display model instead of a slot car chassis. Go ahead and loosen up the nuts or the set screws, holding the front wheels in place. Now loosen up the set screws on the collets of the wrench. And we're going to pull that out. And we'll lift our chassis up off. Now, all we've got to do now is basically clean up what we've got here. We're going to take our Dremel cutoff wheel. It's the thin cutoff wheel, which they have a tendency to break a lot easier than the fatter ones, but I recommend this one basically because being a thinner diameter, you're putting less heat into the material as you cut away. Basically what we're going to do is just take the Dremel tool and we're going to go in here and we're going to cut off these excess pieces of wire, brass plate here on the back motor or back front axle mount, cut them away. It's even wise to go back and forth. Don't try and get too much heat into that chassis while you're cutting these pieces off. Kind of move around, because otherwise you could possibly overheat it and melt your solder. I did it once. It's most aggravating. And I am using my safety glasses. A little warm, so we're going to stop there for a second and let that cool off. We're going to go ahead and take the motor out now. Alright, let's try and finish cutting off the rest of this piece. Alright, we're going to take the cutoff wheel, just use that sort of like a little tool to knock these sharp edges off of the wire where we have cut them off, because they can scratch you pretty badly if you do not clean them up. Alright, those are nice and smooth. Okay, the construction of our chassis is finished. I'm going to go ahead and remove these pins. I'll leave them there for a second. We'll set that down in there. Get these pins out of the way, the ones that located the axles. Pull them out here. And I'm actually going to throw them into a cup here. I'm going to squirt them with Simple Green and let them soak for a while. Although the pins are stainless steel, where the flux is still corrosive, and it's a good idea to clean it all up once you're finished with them. Okay, a couple of things we just need to talk about. The front axle. Basically what you do is you can do a couple of methods here. Find the right set screw. Got myself a slotted axle. Fits nicely inside the diameter of our wheel. And depending on what kind of car you're building, you can use standard slotted wheels. Set screws, tighten them down. The axle will spin inside the brass tube. You can even do independent rotation. Basically slip the wheels on, and you can carefully solder a washer to the outside of the axle, keep the wheel from coming off. What would happen then is that would allow the wheel, and I'm holding the axle in location on this side, but would give you independent rotation on the wheels. You could do that. The other thing you can do is, if you've got a big enough tube, because it will allow you to take it apart later. This is not a good example, but it's not the right size, but you'll get an idea what you could do. Put the wheel on, get yourself a piece of tight-fitting plastic, slip it over the end of the axle, cut off the excess. That would keep the wheel from coming off and still allow the wheel to spin independently on the axle. Can't say this though, there is really very little resistance inside that tube. So even if you go the route of basically just using the set screws to hold the front wheels in, there's not a whole lot of drag in that. Now, you can also build this, and this we built for competition, so that's why we've used the slotted bushings in the back. You could, though, use a piece of brass tubing, and this is what we do on our cars that we're not going to use for competition. And I'm digging around here trying to find a piece of brass. There we go, this will work. It's a little long, but You could solder this brass tubing into there, located on the axle, the jig axle, just the same way with the collets and everything, holding it in place as we did the front. Solder it all up. Once you're done, all you do is take your cutoff wheel, come in here, cut the center out of the tube, and what you end up with is two little stub tubes and your place to put your crown gear. Okay? Now, with this chassis and the way we've built it, there's a couple of things you can do. We'll hopefully there's no set screw there. We're going to slide the axle in here through our crown. Things are a little gummy right now from the flux. Let me get that to where I can get this to move. And we're just going to push the axle through the bushing, through the crown, and out our other bushing here. Alright, there we go. Okay, there's a couple of things you can do. You'll of course be mounting your wheels with set screws. You can locate the rear axle by cutting a piece of 1/8 inch tubing and basically making what is a spacer that would locate the axle. Once the wheels are tightened on the axle, you basically fill in the space between the back side of the hub and the bushings, both sides, and that keeps your wheels from going sideways. You locate them that way. Or probably the best method, and it's a little more tedious, you've got some room down here between the inside of this bushing and the back side of your crown. Basically what you can do is get your spacers, and you can get those from Slot Car Corner, and NSR makes them too, but they're essentially axle spacers. And what you're going to do is fit those spacers down here in between there till basically you get the right mesh between the motor pinion and the crown. You're going to want a little bit of movement there. You don't want the mesh tight, but basically if you do that, the axle is prevented from moving in that direction by the crown riding up against the pinion that would be on the motor shaft, and the axle is prevented from moving off to the right side of the chassis because the crown will be tight to the axle, and at that point it's being restricted in its movement because you've got the bushings in here. The nice thing about doing it that way is if your set screw comes loose on your crown, all it does is spin freely. If one of you do it to one of the other methods and the set screw comes loose, your gear can come out of mesh and it can chew up the teeth on your crown. So what turns into a simple go back in and just tighten down your set screw to get yourself back and going turns out to be you got to disassemble the car because you've chewed up your crown. So definitely like putting the spacers down in between the bushings and the crown itself. When you're cutting away, if you happen to use a brass tube for your, there it is, you're using a brass tube for your rear axle, and again we do this on basically any of the cars we don't intend to race with. When you're cutting away that center section, go slow, cut it and let it cool off. Get it too hot, you can soften the solder, it comes off, your axle is all out of alignment, your chassis probably wouldn't be square because now you know you might have them out of plane. Okay, now one of your final steps is you've got to open up the hole for your guide flag. Now, this is a recommendation, you're going to need to check it yourself, but if you're using a slotted guide flag, you need to open this hole up to about 140 thousandths. If you're using one of Ninco's guide flags, like a Ninco Pro, you need to open it up to around 149 thousandths. I recommend you go a little small, and if it's tight, go your next size up and get it to where you've got a nice wobble-free guide mount, but it'll spin freely so that it's not tight. Okay, basically this is all finished. You do need to wash this with soap and water and a toothbrush. Again, the flux is an acid. The rails will start to rust. All the steel in the car will rust if you do not wash off and neutralize that flux. And as you've seen, as it gets hot and wants to flow around, it also has flowed down into our bushings, kind of gumming those up a little bit. So we need to get that cleaned up so that the axle can spin freely on these bushings. If you're building a Grand Prix car, say something like this BRM, let's do this. We'll slide this in here. There we go. Now, if you've got a car where you need to build suspension components, you just don't want this, axle sticking out there with wheels on it, like looks like what a Cartrix car would look like. Then what you need to do is, now you can go back and you can start soldering, little triangular pieces. Come off of the side rail, come back, make a little triangular piece. You can create a lower A-arm. Same thing up here, you can create an upper A-arm. You can even do that on the front. And basically what you're doing is bending about 25 thousandths wire to simulate what would look like the suspension pieces out there, so that you can replicate that and it looks good. I'd show you my Ferrari 15.8, but unfortunately it's on its way to Canada right now for the final proxy race, so I don't have that to show you. But essentially that's it. Good luck and enjoy. Hopefully Lim doesn't kick my butt with this chassis next year.